Hey listeners, Catherine here. Before we get started with episode 77, I wanted to let you know about Grief, Gratitude, and Greatness. It's a podcast that explores the different ways we grieve, the gratitude that sustains us, and the greatness we discover along the way, one conversation at a time. Host Sarah Shawool engages in intimate, diverse, and compelling conversations with her guests, dissolving stigma and normalizing discussions about grief, trauma, and mental health. This is a really tough time for a lot of us, and many of us are maybe looking for a way to process what they're feeling. So tune into Grief, Gratitude, and Greatness on your favorite pod player via iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and at griefgratitudegreatness.com. And now, time for our show. Hello, and welcome to episode 77 of The Foretop. It's a roundtable discussion of today's hot-button topics in food and beverage. I am your host, Catherine Cole. Once again, we are recording while COVID-19 stay-at-home orders are in effect, and people across the country are a little scared. They're afraid they won't be able to afford their next meal. They're afraid of eating meat from a plant, perhaps where the virus has broken out. They're still seeing food shortages on their store shelves. It's a time when we're thinking about issues of food safety and food security. So the theme for today's episode is living and eating on the edge. Let's meet our panelists. Elle Simone Scott is a familiar face from the cooking show America's Test Kitchen. She's also the founder of the women's networking organization, She Chef Inc. Thank you for joining us, Elle.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. Dr. Don Schaffner is a distinguished professor at Rutgers University and host of Food Safety Talk, a podcast on microbial food safety. Hi, Don.
Hey, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Sophie Egan is the author of a very well-timed new book entitled How to Be a Conscious Eater. She's also a contributor to the New York Times. Hi, Sophie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right, you guys, thanks for being here. Let's get right into our first topic. Don't panic, but food can kill you, like tomorrow. Dr. Don Schaffner, your expertise in food safety was in demand even before the COVID-19 outbreak. Now I'm sure your phone has been ringing off the hook. As we record this, we're reading about COVID-19 outbreaks in meat processing plants. And there's a real sense of fear out there about what is safe to eat. What are you hearing? What are people worried about right now in terms of food safety?
Well, when the pandemic first hit, I got a lot of questions about food safety with respect to COVID-19 or with respect to the virus SARS-CoV-2. And basically, as far as we know, the virus is not spread by food. Now, that doesn't mean that the virus might not be on food, but as far as we know, you cannot contract the virus from eating food. Now, we should, of course, time and date stamp this podcast because things are changing. There's new peer-reviewed or preprint papers coming out all the time, and so that may change. But right now, we know for sure the virus is spread by symptomatic individuals, people sneezing and coughing who have the virus. We also know that a significant number of cases, maybe 50%, but the estimates are all over the place, also come from asymptomatic or maybe more properly pre-symptomatic individuals. These are people that at some point will develop symptoms but don't yet have symptoms. But again, as far as we know, no evidence that the virus is being spread by food or by food packaging or anything like that.
Yeah, and we should say we are recording on May 6, 2020, and this will go live in early June, so things may have changed. That's true. Well, Dr. Don, why are so many people in meatpacking plants specifically getting sick then, if we don't have to worry about the food itself?
That's a really good question. Actually, I was having the same conversation with somebody else earlier today. The short answer is we don't know. The long answer is let me speculate a little bit about why. So anytime people are in close proximity to each other, there's a potential to spread the virus. One thing that we do know is that in meat plants, people work potentially standing very close to one another, even with PPE like cloth face coverings, et cetera. They're standing close to one another. Another thing about meat plants is we need to keep them cold. They need to be cold so that the foodborne pathogens, things like Salmonella and E. coli, don't grow. We also know that the SARS-CoV-2 virus survives better when it's cold, right? And so if you put the virus in a cold, dry place, it's going to last much better than if it's in a warm and wet place. And so, and we also know that the workers in these plants, very often they travel to work together, very often they live together. And so anytime you have a group of individuals, whatever their job is, living and working in close proximity to one another, if one of them gets the virus, it's going to relatively rapidly spread to others.
Mm. And I find it's so ironic that the same kind of refrigeration that keeps the meat fresh and safe is also keeping the virus fresh, basically, is what you're saying?
Yeah, but basically that's true. But of course, the solution is not to raise the temperature in meat plants, right? That would lower
Right.
meat quality. That would accelerate the growth of foodborne pathogens. And again, the other point that I'm making during these interesting times is you sure don't want to relax on normal food safety because you don't want to go to the hospital right now because it's full of people that are suffering from COVID-19. So you don't want to give yourself food poisoning and add to that load on the healthcare system.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit? I mean, most of us, when we think about food safety, we're thinking about things like E. coli, a salmonella. What's the difference between a virus and an infection that might be caused by bacteria?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so we let's talk a little bit about viral diseases that we know for sure can be spread by food. So I've spent the last 5 or 6 years in my lab doing research relative or related to norovirus, which is a virus that is spread by fecal oral contamination. It's also spread by sick people who vomit. And if the virus gets on food and you eat the food, there's a possibility that you can get sick. Another viral disease that we know can be spread by food is hepatitis A, and so we know that. And again, and not to get too nerdy here, but basically, the mode of infection of a virus depends upon the nature of the virus. It depends upon the surface of the virus. It depends upon the kind of cells, the kind of animal cells that the virus is adapted to invade. And so we know for sure there are receptors for norovirus in the gut. And so when you eat norovirus, that means that it can infect those cells and then you get an infection. Same with hepatitis A. Not clear if that happens with SARS-CoV-2. So, and then of course, there's also bacterial foodborne disease, salmonella and E. coli. The good news with respect to viruses is viruses can't actually live outside a host. And so if I were to put norovirus or SARS-CoV-2 or hepatitis on a food, there's no way that those virus particles would increase in concentration until they got inside of a human cell. On the other hand, Salmonella, E. coli, all of these microorganisms can grow on meat products and on surfaces. And again, that's back to your original point, is that because we keep meat plants cold, that slows or prevents the growth of these foodborne pathogenic bacteria.
Elle Scott, I'm wondering, you went to culinary school and now you work in a professional kitchen on air. What sorts of protocols do you follow at work, and what were you taught in terms of sanitation? What do professionals know about food sanitation that the rest of us don't?
I would probably have to say that food service professionals, if trained properly, know more than the average bear about food safety. It's pretty much a requirement for our job. Every city, every state in the United States requires some sort of testing and certification for professional cooks to work in commercial kitchen spaces, and these tests pretty much teach us how to handle food safely, how to deal with food temperature, as Dr. Don mentioned. So temperature is very important, and it plays a huge role in how people in the food and beverage industry go about keeping their customers safe. It's a huge safety measure. It is primary to even serving the food. Even when I worked on the cruise ship, a cruise ship is actually, I think, more stringent. The FDA is more stringent towards cruise ships because of norovirus and things like that. So we'd often have the FDA on board. We could expect them at any given time, but probably once a week, So
So you definitely know a lot more than the average bear, as you said. I mean, it seems like we need the FDA inspecting every part of our society now, from grocery stores to just any place where people are walking around. I think we could all learn something from the food industry. Sophie Egan, your new book addresses a lot of these issues. What are you thinking about right now as you're hearing about all this concern about sanitation and food safety?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so in the book, How to Be a Conscious Eater, I offer essentially a decision making framework for evaluating food choices, a kind of a mental checklist. And I suggest you ask yourself, is this food good for me? Is it good for others? And is it good for the planet? And so some of the things I'm thinking about are that food being safe is definitely a critical way that food can be considered good for you in the context of workers all throughout the supply chain, all throughout the food system from farm to fork. Is it safe for others is also a really critical dimension. And so what I've been talking about throughout the past several months, the book came out in March, is really this idea of like corona conscious eating. Sort of what does it mean to be a conscious eater in light of everything going on right now and into the future? I really come at the food safety side of things from a public health background, but also from an environmental background, and the flip side of food waste. What I think has really been really stunning and brought into glaring view, kind of put under a microscope, is the incongruity of millions of pounds of wasted food that's occurring at the same time that millions of Americans are going hungry. So how does that relate to food safety? This is really how, for the most part, an eater comes into contact with the notion of a food being safe or not. Should I toss it? There's very much a better safe than sorry kind of mentality. And one of the issues that I think is really getting in the way of this is the system we have in place with sell-by dates that really are about quality by and large rather than food safety, but they're perceived as expiration dates. So it's best if used by, sell by, et cetera. This actually accounts for about 20% of consumer waste of perfectly safe edible food, and not to mention $29 billion of wasted consumer spending each year. So there is legislation underway, the Food Date Labeling Act of 2019, that would really go a long way in addressing consumer confusion. 90% of us toss that perfectly edible food, and a 2-date labeling scheme would really go a long way. 1 date label for quality and 1 for safety. But in the meantime, it's just really challenging, other than the kind of sensory aspects of, does this thing have mold? Does it smell off? It's really challenging often for folks to avoid a lot of that waste out of the very understandable fears that it could do them harm.
Especially right now when food is short, it seems like people shouldn't be tossing things out just because there's an expiration date. In many cases, these things are still delicious and edible. I mean, even with dairy products.
Because, as I mentioned, those dates are often, there's not standardization, and more often it's actually about an expectation or a desired texture or flavor or kind of quality threshold or bar that the manufacturer has in mind for you to enjoy with their products, so that you will buy that product again. In terms of actual foodborne illness, that usually doesn't happen because of decay or aging, but more of actually contamination, a foodborne pathogen or pathogen on farm or at a processing plant. And so there are, of course, exceptions. The date labels that are most important to pay attention to are the same general foods where there's extra guidance for pregnant women. So things like deli meats, unpasteurized dairy products, ready to eat refrigerated foods, and kind of the prepared foods and things like that. They can be higher risk from a listeria standpoint, but many, many, many other foods can be enjoyed well past that point. And so there's lots of tricks. There's a great website, actually, savethefood.com. Dr. John, I'd love to hear your take on this, because I really think there's nuance, and that's important to keep in mind. But generally speaking, it seems like there's much room for improvement in avoiding unnecessary, perfectly edible food being tossed out, and while still enjoying food safely.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Sophie. And there's a couple of points I want to make in response to what you've said. So the first one is that some of my friends who have also been sheltering in place, one in particular is actually eating expired foods from her cupboard and reporting on them. But you're absolutely right. In most cases, the problem is because the manufacturer has said, we believe this food will be best quality if you consume it by this date. But of course, that's not considered in the phrasing of the expiration date. There is one food that's very important that you adhere to the expiration date, and that is infant formula. And the reason why is that in any processed food, the nutritional content goes down over time. For most of us in America, we have overnutrition. We have an abundance of nutrition. But For infants, that's not true. If the infant formula is the sole food that they're consuming, and that food is nutritionally deficient because it's past its expiration date, that infant can actually develop a deficiency and might even die. And so that's the one exception. And then to Sophie's point about deli meats and raw milk cheeses, those are great foods for pregnant women to avoid, whether they're in or out of their shelf life date. And so that, I think that's a really important point to emphasize as well. But yeah, otherwise, I think what Sophie said is exactly correct. These dates are put there by manufacturers to basically ensure quality. And again, there's a little bit of wiggle room depending upon the food. If it's a dry processed food like pasta or rice, you're fine. If it's a canned food where it's you're past the date, but the can is not swollen or leaking, that's also perfectly fine. Milk in a carton, well, that milk might actually be spoiled. It's not going to make you sick, but it's a little bit disgusting, and I don't I don't personally like to drink spoiled milk. On the other hand, while we're talking about dairy products, yogurt is basically spoiled milk already, right? It's been deliberately spoiled by a specific microorganism, and so if that yogurt sits in your fridge, especially unopened, if it sits in your fridge for an extended period of time, it's just going to be a little bit more sour. Now, what can happen with open yogurt and open cheeses and things like that is sometimes they'll develop some mold, but you can just cut around that and you'll be good to go.
This is true. Well, and it's, the reason we're even talking about this kind of thing is that in many places in the country, in many households, Americans are experiencing real food shortages for the first time in their lives. They may have lost their jobs. It may just be that where they live, the supermarket shelves are empty. And that is kind of a nice segue into our next topic, which is there a new empathy today for food insecurity? Elle Simone Scott, your undergraduate degree and your professional background were in social work before you entered the culinary industry, so you have a really strong perspective on this. You recently wrote a piece for the James Beard Foundation, and we will post that on our social media feed, about a time when you found yourself in the position of actually needing the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, when you were a student in culinary school.
Yeah.
You'd been providing that to clients when you were a social worker, so you knew a lot about it. So, what are you seeing right now as you see kind of the current national awareness of food insecurity? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts.
I was actually having a conversation about this with my colleagues earlier. I think the country is in a very interesting position because I think to some degree at this very moment, we are all experiencing a level of food insecurity, right? I was just having a conversation with my mother today about how accessibility to meat is going to decrease, and she was like, completely outdone with that. And I was like, hey, like we have options. I think people are experiencing not being able to get their normal food staple items in their local grocery stores. And while certainly it has no direct comparison to actual generational poverty and food insecurity, as it relates to food sovereignty and all those things, but I think that right now we are all experiencing just a tinge of that vulnerability of not being able to get the things that we want. Also, not knowing how long supplies will last. And just to kind of backpedal a little bit about expiration dates, it was originally the FDA that required manufacturers to come up with some type of system that would keep consumers safe in terms of how to buy food. But it is also a system that was put in place to hold, companies accountable to their consumers, right? So no food can sit on a truck for 2 weeks when it gets delivered to the store. Like it has to be on the shelves by a certain date. This is also something that was intended in a very underlying kind of way to protect marginalized people and people who live in the intersection who might even be on those poverty lines. It required some accountability so that they weren't getting old food or expired food or, like making sure, trying to attempt to level the playing field. But I really think, even when I was a SNAP recipient in the early 2000s when I was in culinary school, I lived in the middle of Brooklyn and it was probably just on the cusp of pre gentrification. And there were very few fresh food markets in my neighborhood. I kind of had to go out of the way a little bit to access things like that. But of course, once gentrification was in motion, a lot of fresh food markets came up in the hood, in the middle of Brooklyn, in the middle of Bed-Stuy. And So I've seen a lot of shifts in communities. I remember when Whole Foods, the first, which wasn't too long ago, the first Whole Foods popped up in Harlem. Trader Joe's was probably something that was slightly more accessible to people in the hood, but not completely. Um, so I think at this moment, where we all have to stand in line, whether you're shopping at ShopRite or, whoever your run of the mill grocer is, or if you shop at Whole Foods, we all have to stand in line. We all have to get up early, to make an attempt to get the things that we need, just the basic needs. We're no longer able to be extremely particular about brands. Like I'm not gonna lie to you. There's a certain type of toilet paper that I like to use. However, I'm gonna buy what's there when I get there, So I think everyone is kind of starting to get a chance to experience what that vulnerability feels like of not being able to have your normal, we'll call it normal in quotations. I'm throwing up rabbit ears when I say words like normal or usual. We're not, we are outside of our norm.
Yeah, and Elle, I think that's such a brilliant point of how more widely dispersed that feeling of vulnerability is, and you really see it too in numbers coming out of organizations like Feeding America and other hunger relief organizations who are reporting, huge percentages of those accessing food at food banks are first time users,
Yeah.
first time recipients, and I think that's a really critical point that you're raising is it's oftentimes folks who maybe never thought they'd be in that position, and definitely to the kind of starting question of this part of our conversation about is there greater empathy. I mean, I think there's not only greater empathy, there's increased experience of lack of access.
Hmm.
This crisis really has shown not only the glaring light on the inequities in terms of food access, but also just the rigidity of the current food system
Yes.
that is not nearly as agile as it needs to be to, this is not an issue of not having enough total food. It's having food in the wrong places.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You know what? It reminds me of, like, how in there are some states who have like super antiquated laws, like you can't marry your third cousin. That's what the food it's kind of that's kind of like how the food system is. I feel like there have been so many advancements in the food system, but like the Food Labeling Act, it has not grown with that. Some of our structures in the food system are very antiquated. They don't get updated. I mean, if you look at some of the rules, the federal rules and guidelines for SNAP, it just they're ludicrous. It's like if you have a car, if you own a vehicle, then your income, that means you make too much money to actually qualify for SNAP. This is what they were actually trying to pass recently. I mean, if I live in a rural space where even the neighbor's house is like 12 yards away, that means my where I work is probably even further than that in town. The only way I would even be able to work and contribute to my household is to own this car. It does not mean that I make too much money to feed my three children and my spouse.
Totally.
So like these systems that are put in place, they just never grow up with the system, or they remain very immature.
Mm-hmm. It's so true. It just makes you scratch your head truly at how the status quo has been maintained for so long. And if anything, it's just hopefully that greater, revelations about these cracks and antiquated policies in many ways can just garner greater, essentially political will to change what's been an issue for many people for a long time and just wasn't as much in the forefront.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that people speak up when they see something that's not right. And this conversation reminds me of, actually, I think it was the first real engagement in something related to food around the pandemic. And a friend of mine from another university reached out and said, "Hey, look, I'm hearing that certain food banks are deciding to reject donations of foods that are coming from areas where there's an ongoing COVID outbreak, right?" And so, obviously now it's everywhere, but at the beginning it was in Washington State, and people were saying, "Well, we're not going to take food bank donations from Washington State." And And my friend and I scratched our head and said, wait, no, there's no evidence that it's spread by a food. And people are going to need food banks more now in this time than any other time. So we need to stop this ridiculous situation. And so we wrote a letter. We got a bunch of our other friends with PhDs to sign on that letter. And fortunately, we're able to stop that process because, again, here's somebody acting out of a good intention. Hey, we don't want people to become sick with COVID-19 from taking these donated foods. But then you have to look at the science and say, well, scientifically, that really doesn't make sense. And so if you really want to help people, you should allow those donations and not prohibit them.
Wow.
So, I mean, so much of what we're talking about, there's something about the food system that is just so completely absurd. And Elle, in your essay for the James Beard Foundation, you talked about this absurd fact that a lot of people who work in fine dining kitchens can't afford food. They've got food all around them every day. I mean, even before COVID-19, and didn't make enough to be able to afford good food. I just,
Yeah,
it's
and
so
it
frustrating.
goes even deeper than that. There was recently an article posted in Eater about a chef who worked for a very prestigious restaurant group, and he was a Latino brother, maybe in his 50s. He was legendary in the industry. Like, he pretty much trained up everyone that came through the kitchens of this particular restaurant group. And he died of COVID with no health insurance, no type of supplemental insurance to support his family. His children had to do a GoFundMe for his funeral. So it stems even deeper than, you know, working in a space where people who have an over accessibility to food and fine dining and being a part of that system, but not being able to probably support your family in general, and that is hugely problematic. And I've recently started to have these conversations with industry leaders so that we can get at the core of this pandemic within a pandemic, if you will. And it's called Table Stakes, and they're on YouTube. They're on America's Test Kitchen's YouTube. And I just have conversations with the industry leaders to talk about how, although the pandemic has completely disrupted the food system as we've known it, we definitely don't want it to come back looking exactly as it did before the pandemic. It's not a process that's going to take 2 years or 3 years. I mean, we're talking about, at least a couple of hundreds of years of systematic oppression of sorts inside the food system chain. Neighborhoods of people, of the marginalized people who are obviously and statistically being more at risk of COVID than anyone, like the statistics behind, Black and brown people dying from COVID because of underlying health issues, which we all know has everything to do with the accessibility of good, clean, healthy foods. Is a huge problem. I would really love for us to be able to add to a conversation about how we can, move to change that. Like, now that we have a food system that's been completely destructured, what can we do? What are some thoughts or ideas about new implementations to make sure that, now that we're all eating from food pantries and food boxes, does that mean that eventually we'll all be able to eat in an equitable way? I hope so.
Yeah, this is such a good point, Ellen. I'm so glad that you made it, and it's something that I've been thinking about and talking about in interviews. And we realize, I mean, food workers are essential workers, but you know what? They deserve to be paid a living wage, and they
Yeah.
deserve to have health care, right? And many of them, honestly, many of the folks working in agriculture and in meat processing plants are brown skinned, and they might be here illegally. And you know what? They should have a path to citizenship too, right? And
Mhm.
so we were talking in the pre-show about how the pandemic is accelerating certain things, but it's also exposing some real inequities that we
Yes.
need to start talking about. And I'm so glad that you're doing the things that you're doing to do that, because it's so. I mean, it's like, now's the time, right? If we're going to fix this, we should fix this now, right?
Mhm.
It's just made it so abundantly clear that these folks that are doing this work are so important, and we need to take care of them.
That's right.
I mean, it is interesting that our administration was about to cut food stamps for a number of Americans, I think a couple 100,000 Americans, right before this COVID-19 hit. And now they've reversed that. And I think that the nation is starting to see how important these programs are, and that we really do need to augment them.
Technically, we all need food stamps at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, people are now experiencing what marginalized people deal with on a regular basis and having to approach the social service agencies. Like there are people who are still calling trying to get their very first unemployment check, and we're almost 3 months into this pandemic, right? And it is a scare when you are calling a number that's supposed to work with you, that's supposed to be a resource for you, and you're getting a machine telling you that you have to try again a week from the day that you just tried to call. Like everyone is actually really, really feeling it. So yeah, I hope it levels the playing field in a meaningful way.
We have to move to our next segment, but I wanted to ask you all before we move on, you all are experts in various parts of this field. Do you all have suggestions for our listeners as to how they can help make change in this area?
Vote, volunteer. Those are some real good first steps.
Vote with your
Yeah.
vote and vote with your grocery basket.
Yeah, there are also lots of food banks running in various cities. You can, I would say, first check out World Central Kitchen, which is by Chef Jose Andres. There are also some World Central WCK subgroups. I was about to say WCR. That's a different group. WCK, World Central Kitchen subgroups in different cities. So they partnered with World Central Kitchen, and they are running some type of soup kitchen, food bank in their city. And so if you're looking for someone to donate to, that's a great start. And if you want to know a little bit more, you can always visit like my Instagram or YouTube, America's Test Kitchen's YouTube, for table stakes. And each speaker, each person, each guest leaves at the very end of their message a way that you can help donate and support the cause.
Okay, folks, time to take a quick break and learn about our sponsor. If you don't want to venture out right now, Zupan's Markets in the Portland area are offering a personal shopping and curbside pickup service. You can call or order online and pick up anything from a flower arrangement to a ready-to-heat dinner for 4. Order by noon for same-day pickup between 3 and 7 p.m. I just checked out the 9 different options for ready-to-heat family meals on the Zupan's website today, and I was very enticed. I saw chile rellenos, poke bowls, vegan tamales, meatloaf, and more. I also recently went to Zupan's with my mask on and picked up some beautiful halibut cakes for dinner. Everything from the fresh seafood and meat to the produce, the prepared dishes, the fresh baked goods, it's all of the highest quality there. And of course, I love browsing the wine selection. Whether you're looking for a specialty sea salt or an artisanal pasta, or just a really nice scented candle to lift your spirits, it's a real pleasure to shop there. Founded by John Zupan in 1975 and now run by his son Mike, Zupan's is Portland's family-owned grocery store with 3 locations to serve you in Portland and Lake Oswego. Visit Zupans.com and sign up for the email list to receive exclusive deals and promotions. Thanks, Zupans! So on to our third course, how to make the right food choices. Sophie Egan, your new book, How to Be a Conscious Eater, addresses just about everything we've discussed today. It was published recently and it contains some very prescient statements. I wonder if we could take a step back and look at the big picture and talk about the choices that we make every day about the foods we eat.
First and foremost, you must like the food that you taste and you must be able to afford it. So those are whole separate topics. But in this book in particular, it's really focused on, okay, of your grocery dollars that you do have to, as was mentioned, sort of vote with your grocery basket, how do you align your food choices with your values? And that is really the crux of what I consider to be conscious eating. It's not a diet. It's not a strict regimen. It's a lifelong pursuit of an intention to raise your awareness and align as many of your actions in the food marketplace as possible in support of or against those practices. So I look at food choices through the lenses of your own health, community health, and planetary health. And it's not, realistic to think that we can make every single choice hit all 3 of those boxes every single time we put something in our mouths. That would just be utterly overwhelming. And there's a lot of already information and misinformation and really disinformation out there as it is. And so the book was aimed at trying to help navigate that confusion that so many readers, just eaters, truly have, and empowering them to make food choices they can feel good about. And the great news is that more often than not, what's good for us is also good for others and is also good for the planet. Lentils, for example, very minimally resource intensive form of protein that is nitrogen fixing, improves the soil health, is super healthy and super affordable, and because it doesn't involve any animals, is not an animal welfare concern.
Good thing lentils are so delicious.
Yeah.
Elle, I was going to ask you, you're on the board of the Ovarian Cancer Research Alliance, and you're a survivor of ovarian cancer. And I'm wondering if, you think about food choices a lot differently now than you used to.
I wish I could say absolutely they have changed, but I think I'm only saying no because I've always been pretty conscious and aware about where I source food. I'm a food stylist and I come from the old school of hand shopping things. And so I've spent lots of time in farmers markets and between here in New York, and I've created some really good relationships with farmers. I think the biggest difference for me is that pre and post cancer is that post cancer, I've definitely become more conscious of being an active participant in direct source to consumer shopping. Like I would go to the grocery store, and this is not to say that the grocery store is bad or it's not something that you should do, but um, as I've started to have relationships with farmers and butchers, fishmongers, I'm learning about all of the middle things that need to happen to get food from the source to the market. And, not only is time something to consider, but it's also like relationship. A lot of farmers, as we mentioned, are not paid well, and so I have to make the decision of, do I want to go to the market and pay the cost that gets split between three different entities, or can I just go to the farmer and buy straight from the farm and give them my money directly? And I've opted to be a more direct consumer. I think that has definitely been the difference, like being more aware of just where my food comes from and how is it processed? Is it over processed? Or just being aware, knowing the source is hugely important to me, because once you have a relationship with a food service provider of any way, in any organization, be it corporate or mom and pop, if you not realize, once you have a relationship with those people who handle your food quality is better. Am I right? You know, you become friends with the guys who own the bodega on the corner of your block in Brooklyn. They're going to give you the freshest deli meat, the best cheese, the newest bread from their baker. They're going to give you the best sandwich. And it's because you're invested, and so I think just becoming more invested has been a big switch for me, being a cancer survivor.
Ella, it's so inspiring just to hear your whole point of view and how you think about this. I really think it's so elegant, and kind of taking a step back, I think what it comes down to is really trying with the point about relationships is who do you trust and how do you gain transparency? What are the means of sort of looking under the hood, so to speak? And it's not because food producers or growers or processors or distributors or anyone is malicious. Fundamentally, often they're business people, and that what can happen is shortcuts can be made, and when you are shortening that distance between through direct consumer or just finding retailers or restaurateurs or chefs who you trust, or third-party certifiers, like I mentioned, it's kind of just figuring out for you what are those daily routines or weekly routines that enable you to gain that higher awareness and really, I think fundamentally it comes down to trust and transparency and how you find those.
That's so true. And I know, people don't know that you can go to your market and ask your butcher, your fishmonger, the source of all the fish or all the meat. Every store is required to have a binder that has the information about their source provider. Whole Foods has it. Every market has it. People just don't know that they can ask for it. So usually it's just I feel like we've been conditioned to put a lot of trust in the system that creates our food system, the system within the system, that we're never taught that we can question the system. I mean, I think
Mhm.
traditionally that's like an overall problem in this country. Like no one remembers that they're empowered to question the system. You don't have to go with the flow. You can ask questions. You can seek information, and sometimes it's just an ask. And if they don't tell you you can ask, you won't. But if you know that you can ask, you will. So I just always remind people, ask the question.
What's so critical about what you said is that it's a feedback loop too. The more that producers, providers, retailers, et cetera, hear from conscious eaters, hear from engaged, empowered citizens, as eaters, raising your voices goes such a long way in really shifting the disclosure of information. And not only, sometimes when there's disclosure, greater degrees of granularity of information that's being provided, it actually forces the formulation of products to change. That's what we
That's
learned
right.
from calorie labeling, is that actually calorie labeling only affects some people's choices in food service settings, and of those, it affects it very minimally. The bigger impact that calorie labeling has had in fast food chains and broad volume food service is reformulation, because retail providers, food service providers, realized they'd have to disclose all this information, not
Hmm.
just calories, but the nutrition information, and they said, wow, well, we got to clean up some of those recipes. So that's such a powerful mechanism for shifting the actual system, as you said, through your individual raising your voice, asking those questions.
Before we head out, I want to hear Dr. Don's thoughts on making the right food choices. What do you counsel people when they ask you, how do I make the right choices, Dr. Don?
Well, yeah. So thank you so much. So it's been an absolute pleasure being on this call with Elle and with Sophie. And one thing about speaking up. So, and this, I've been trying to not speak up because as a white male who's a tenured professor, that's my whole job, is to speak up to people. And so I try really hard not to talk over people who are having great conversations. So thank you both for that. And Sophie, I just want you to know this is probably a hard way to get downloads, but I just bought your book. So you have to go on more podcasts. So thank you. And Elle, we already watch America's Test Kitchen, so I'm already a fan. So yeah, so when in speaking about food choices and Sophie's book. Thinking about trade-offs, one thing that kept resonating with me is, so I just finished serving 2 years chairing a subcommittee that was providing advice to food companies that deliver food via mail or through third-party delivery services, and then also, companies that will deliver takeout food to you, and especially in terms of the longer term delivery, like where foods are shipped over multiple days. And I really like the Sophie's topic of her book, and it made me think about trade-offs. Like, so from a food safety perspective, we want lots of packaging, right? Because that's going to help control the temperature of the food, which is going to help keep food safety under control. But on the other hand, for the health of the planet, we don't want that, right? And so, to me, the really exciting space now is thinking about what are ways that we can optimize, all of the things that Sophie's talking about in her book, right? So optimize for me, optimize for others, optimize for the planet, but at the same time, and look for places where we can get a win-win-win, right? And then look for places where there are trade-offs, and then try to make those trade-offs in intelligent ways. And in terms of the pandemic, what I've been doing is we've been cooking a lot more than normal because we're not traveling, we're just home. But then also when we do get takeout, I'm giving my business to non-chain restaurants, right? There's a local pizza place, there's a local Thai restaurant, there's a local Indian place. The Indian place actually closed down, but then they opened up again for takeout. And so we're trying to give our takeout business to those, for the most part, trying to give our takeout business to those family-owned mom and pop restaurants that we want to see make it through this time.
Well, you guys are all making me feel very hopeful, and I just hope that all of you will continue to share your thoughts with the world, because you've all inspired me. We're now at the point of our show, we call it dessert, our dessert course, where we each go around and share something food or beverage related that we've been enjoying this week. Does anyone have a dessert they'd like to share?
Yeah, I've got one that is both a food and a beverage choice. And so I recently gave a webinar, and in exchange for giving the webinar, it was for the fruit industry. They sent me a lovely fruit basket, which had a bunch of really great oranges. And so I ate those oranges, and they were fantastic. But my wife said to me, "Hey, look, Save those orange peels, because there is a dish that I want to make, and I'll send you guys a link. It's a link to a lovely YouTube video entitled "Summer Orange Gummy and Syrup," and basically it's a recipe for making candied orange rinds. And the candied orange rinds are fantastic, and we've been enjoying them. But the real benefit, the side benefit, is this wonderful sweet orange syrup, which, when mixed in the proper proportion with a glass of bourbon, is just out of this world. So that's my food and beverage recommendation. And again, I'll send you guys a link.
Oh, that sounds delicious. How about Elle? Did you have a dessert item to share?
Yeah, I've been making funnel cakes in my cast iron skillet.
Yum.
Fair food, carnival food makes me super happy. So that's kind of what I've been making. And it's carbs. Carbs make me happy. Duh.
It's important to be happy.
We
It's
need them right
important to be happy right now. Yeah. I mean, I'm like choosing between cocktails, funnel cakes. I'm like, I'll take the funnel cakes. So that's my dessert right now.
Where can we find a recipe?
Honestly, let me tell you, I was just at my grocery store and I found like a pre-made batter that had a cute little spout. It was in a little spout bucket. And I was like, that looks like something I could make in 5 minutes. And it was a literal add water thing. But I'm pretty sure you can find a funnel cake recipe anywhere. But if you want my donut hole recipe, it's in you can find that at America's Test Kitchen, and that's an actual cast iron recipe. It's fried donut holes in your cast iron.
Yeah.
You can get that. And you can also, I mean, right now, America's Test Kitchen is giving 3 months for $1. So you could like go in and like rack up on all the recipes you could possibly love for $1.
We're going to have to post all that on social. I love it. True confessions of a professional cook.
We hate cooking. That's a confession.
Sophie, did you have a dessert item to share?
I do. Well, and I have to just say, only a test kitchen chef starts off with, I just casually been making funnel cakes in a skillet. I mean, that is, like, whoever your quarantine mate is very lucky. I've been really loving, it's called Ground Up Nut Butters. It's a Portland-based nut butter company. I really enjoy not only peanut butter, but all kinds of nut butters. And I've been sending them as gifts to people during this time who are having their birthdays in quarantine, because it's like an exceptionally delicious example of a food that's good for you, others, and the planet. It's super healthy, but happens to be amazingly delicious. Nuts in general are pretty low environment, and it's got an awesome social mission with a really great workforce training program for women getting back on their feet. And they have this really lovely tagline of spread good. And I think we could all use some good to be spread right now.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. We will definitely post about that on our social media feed. My dessert item is this is for podcast lovers like me. If you didn't know this already, you can listen to Trevor Noah's Daily Show as a podcast, and it's currently called the Daily Social Distancing Show. And yesterday's show, that would have been May 5th. He was just riffing about,
I'm sick of the government telling us what to do, telling us to wear masks. You got those red lights that tell us when we can drive, stopping me from buying romaine lettuce because it has E. coli on it. Some of us like the taste of E. coli. It's called the refined palate.
and it was perfect. And I thought, I'm perfectly in the mood for today's episode. And that's our show. So thank you, panelists. Sophie Egan is the author of a new book entitled How to Be a Conscious Eater. She's also a contributor to the New York Times. Thanks for being here, Sophie.
Thanks so much.
Elle Simone Scott is a food stylist and on-air personality on the cooking show America's Test Kitchen. She's also founder of the women's networking organization She Chef Inc. Thanks for being here, Elle.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Dawn Schaffner is a distinguished professor at Rutgers University and host of Food Safety Talk, a podcast on microbial food safety. Good to have you here, Dr. Dawn.
Thanks, Catherine. It was an absolute pleasure.
Today's episode of The Four Top was recorded in remote locations all over the United States. I'm here in the high-fiber, protein-packed city of Portland, Oregon, in my bedroom, not in the studios of OPB. Izzy Kramer is our tireless producer. Keelan King is our editor, and he also composed and performed our theme music. Special thanks to the web staff at OPB who bring our show to life on the Oregon Public Broadcasting website, as well as to sound supervisor Stephen Cray. You can check out our dedicated website, thefourtop.org, to learn more about us. Listen to back episodes, donate to the show, and reach out to us on social media. And if you have not already subscribed to The Four Top on iTunes, NPR One, or Spotify, please help us out and do so by leaving us a rating. I'm your host, Catherine Cole, and I'm going to go wash my hands and go to a farmer's market now. Bye-bye.